Today I'm canning corn and corn cob jelly, and this video was requested by one of my subscribers that goes by the name of Bears Here. They just canned some of this and they liked it so much that they wanted to share it with all of you. Well, they don't make videos, so they asked me if I could make some and make a video of it to get it out there. So that's what I'm doing today. Believe it or not, this corn cob jelly is a USDA approved recipe, and I'll put a link in the description box. You're supposed to use corn cobs from field corn, but I don't have access to any of that right now, so I'm using sweet corn that I bought from the grocery store. I'm only using a dozen ears for this because that's what the jelly recipe calls for, and I thought it would also be a good way to gauge just how much corn you would need if you wanted to can your own corn. People say that this jelly tastes a lot like honey. The first thing you need to do is shuck the corn, remove the silks, and wash it. After the corn was shucked and washed, I blanched it for 3 minutes. I just boil it for 3 minutes, then I put it into cold water for at least 3 minutes. Then I cut the corn off the cobs, and you guessed it, I have gadgets for this. You can use a knife if you want to, but I have this handy little gadget that I bought at the Dollar Tree. Works great. You just put it on there and push it down. It does take a lot of effort to push it down. If you could stand over it, it would probably help. But it does take it off perfectly for canning whole kernel corn. And if that's too much of a struggle for you, I have another gadget that'll cut corn off the cob too. That's a little easier to use, but you need to be careful not to cut your hand with this one. It just takes more time to use this gadget because you're just cutting little sections of the corn at a time. But you can adjust that blade to different heights, and I had it set for cream corn from the last time that I canned corn, so you can see that it cuts it differently. When you're cutting the corn off of the cob, for whole kernel corn you should cut about 2/3 of the way through the kernel. For cream corn you should cut half the way through the kernel, and then you scrape the cob to remove the milk. So here's what I ended up with. It was a little over 2 quarts. I'm going to make the jelly first. You're supposed to cut the cobs into 4-inch pieces. I found it's easiest just to break them into thirds. Then you're supposed to add 2 quarts of water, or enough to cover the cobs. I ended up adding 2 quarts and maybe an extra cup. Then I boiled the corn cobs for 40 minutes. The next thing I did was strain the juice from the cobs, and I used a piece of unbleached muslin. Now I rinsed that in hot water first. I measured out the juice and I had 5½ cups, so I added another ½ a cup of water to make it 6. Then I added 2 boxes of pectin and I brought it to a boil. When the mixture came to a boil, I added 6 cups of sugar and I brought it back to a boil, stirring constantly, and boiled it for 5 minutes. When the 5 minutes was up, I removed it from the heat and skimmed off the foam. Now it's ready to can. I have my lids and rings at a simmer and my jar is hot and ready. I take a hot jar and I fill it with the jelly to within 1/4 inch of the top. I wipe the rim of the jar clean. I added a hot lid and a hot ring, and I tightened it firmly. Then I set it back in the water bath canner to stay warm until I had all of the jars full. When all of the jars were full, I dropped the rack down into the canner and I made sure there was at least 1 inch of water covering the jars. Then I put the lid on the pot and I processed it for 10 minutes. The instructions say to process this for 5 minutes. However, if you process anything for less than 10 minutes, you get into sterilization issues. And if you can, assembly line fashion, I strongly advise to process this for 10 minutes. When the time was up, I turned off the heat, removed the lid, and let it sit for 5 minutes. Then I removed the jars and put them on a towel on the counter to cool. The next day, remove the rings, wash the jars, write corncob jelly on the top, and the date that you canned them. Now I'm going to can my corn, and the reason that I did the jelly first is because now I have the water bath canner full of hot water. It's an easy matter to heat my jars for my corn. I got a little over 2 quarts of corn from this dozen of ears, so for every quart of corn you need to add 2 cups of water and a teaspoon of salt. I'm hot packing this corn, and believe me, if you take shortcuts with corn or if you get lazy with this process, it can come back to bite you. So this is the way you need to do it. Let me change that. You can can your corn any way you want to can your corn, unless I'm your mama. Then this is the way it needs to be done. So I boiled the corn for 5 minutes and it's ready to be canned. I have my lids and rings at a simmer. I have my jars hot and ready. I take a hot jar. I fill it with corn, leaving 1-inch headspace. I remove the air bubbles. I wipe the rim of the jar clean. I added a hot lid, a hot ring, and I tightened it firmly. Then I placed the jar in the water bath canner to stay warm until I had all of the jars full. By the way, I'm using 3/4 pint jars for this. I mentioned these jars to I'm a Survivor and a Thriver recently, and she said she'd never seen these. They're a great size because there's only 2 of us, and a pint is often too much, and a half pint isn't enough. So the 3/4 size works out great. Also, keep in mind that I'm canning whole kernel corn. If you're canning cream corn, you should not can that in quarts. It has density issues, and it also has to be processed for a longer time. So if you're canning cream corn, be sure to very closely look at the directions in a canning book. Corn also has expansion issues, and by pre-cooking it like this, you can avoid a lot of problems. Believe me, I would not do this any other way. Corn also has issues because of the kernel itself. I don't remember all the specifics, but something about the way that the coating on the corn protects the inner parts. It's very hard for heat to penetrate sufficiently to can this. That's why it needs such a long processing time. Now that all of the jars are full, I transfer them from the water bath canner into my pressure canner. You can heat your jars and use it to keep the jars warm with the pressure canner. However, with mine, if I get that pot hot, it's very difficult to get the lid onto it. That's why I do this in the water bath canner. Then I put water in the pressure canner, put the lid on, and you need to follow your manufacturer's directions for your pressure canner. And I processed the jars for 55 minutes at 10 pounds pressure, but you need to adjust for your altitude. And if you're canning quarts, they need to be processed for 1 hour and 25 minutes. When the processing time was complete, I turned off the heat and I let the canner sit for at least 30 minutes. I removed the lid and I took the jars out of the canner and set them on a towel on the counter to cool. The next day, remove the rings, wash the jars, write corn on the top and the date that you canned them. So there you go. From a dozen ears of corn, I ended up with what would be the equivalent of 5 1/4 pints of corn and 4 3/4 pints of corncob jelly. This jelly is real good. It does taste similar to honey. So there you go, bears here. Corn and corncob jelly canned by the book as requested. And if any of you call me Mom, this is the way you have to do it. Hope it helps.